The air above the entrance was thick with the scent of high-octane diesel and decaying vegetation, a noxious blend that always heralded the proximity of death or supply lines. Specialist Rick Scrapper, Hogan knelt beside the barely visible opening, a black, ragged tear in the earth beneath the roots of an ancient banyan tree. The intelligence briefing had been terse. This complex, rumored to extend far deeper than the standard VC complexes, was a staging ground for a major sabotage operation targeting Firebase Grizzly's fuel depot 3 kilometers away. Hogan, despite his nickname, was profoundly claustrophobic. It was a crippling fear he managed to suppress only by focusing on the mission's mechanical necessity. He stripped down to his webbing, helmet lamp, suppress .45 pistol, and a K-bar knife. Sergeant Miller looked down at him, his face a mask of sweat and concern. "Scrapper, you hit pay dirt, you get out. Don't go deep for ghosts." Hogan nodded, adjusting the wire connecting him to the surface communication reel. The waiting was the worst part. That paralyzing moment before plunging into the unknown, where the jungle's vastness gave way to the coffin-like pressure of the subterranean world. He imagined the tons of earth pressing down, ready to swallow him whole. He took a final, deep, desperate breath of the humid surface air. The sounds of distant artillery fire a final, fading reminder of the world he was leaving. He knew that the moment he dropped into that hole, every sound, every shadow, and every inch of movement would become a matter of immediate life and death. This wasn't combat yet. This was the agonizing, slow descent into pure, unadulterated suspense. Hogan plunged feet first into the humid darkness, the jungle floor disappearing instantly above him. The initial drop was a tight chute, scraping against his shoulders, pulling the last vestiges of oxygenated air from his lungs. When his boots hit the floor of the main shaft, the world shrank dramatically. The silence that enveloped him was immediate and oppressive, the deafening absence of the million insects, birds, and wind of the surface. He switched on his helmet lamp, its weak beam cutting a lonely cone through the dust motes, dancing in the oppressive heat. This tunnel was different. It was reinforced, the walls packed tight with clay and lined in places with cleverly harvested bamboo slats, suggesting permanence and strategic importance. He began the endless, hunched crawl, his hands sweeping the floor ahead of him for tripwires or toe poppers. The smell was overpowering, a thick, fetid odor of mildewed cloth, stale urine, rotten food, and a pervasive metallic tang that Hogan instantly recognized as dried blood. He moved agonizingly slowly, measuring each footstep. The radio wire dragged behind him, a fragile lifeline. He passed 3 abandoned sleeping bays, crude hammocks slung high to avoid floor dampness, but no immediate sign of habitation. The waiting wasn't for an attack. The waiting was for a sign, any sign, that the unseen occupants knew he was there. His own breath sounded like a roar in his ears, and the pounding of his heart against his ribs felt loud enough to betray his presence to anyone within 50 yards. The tunnel branched unexpectedly, forming a tight, inverted Y junction that required him to turn sideways to maneuver. He extinguished his lamp, relying on the faint, ambient glow reflecting off the damp walls, a technique used to confuse VC watching for movement. He chose the right passage, feeling a sudden, intense chill that suggested a draft from a deeper chamber or perhaps another entrance. As he pivoted, his knee brushed against something taut, a wire, invisible in the gloom, strung low across the floor. It wasn't attached to an explosive. Instead, it connected to a crude, cantilevered clay pot filled with pebbles, designed to crash and signal his arrival. Hogan froze, sweat beading on his forehead, listening to the echoing clatter as the pot shattered 30 feet ahead. He instantly dropped into a firing position, but no shots came. Instead, he heard the faint, unsettling sounds of movement, not the shuffle of boots, but the dull scrape of heavy objects being dragged. Then a low, grinding rumble. The VC were responding not with fire, but with structural engineering. He realized the tunnel walls around him were subtly vibrating. A low-frequency thud echoed from the junction he had just passed, followed by the sickening sound of falling rock and packed earth. They hadn't tried to kill him yet. They had sealed the exit. Hogan was now trapped, locked deep within the earth, the suspense of the inevitable confrontation instantly multiplying tenfold. The shock of the collapse subsided, leaving Hogan entombed in a space barely larger than a coffin. The connection reel went dead, the lines severed by the falling debris. His claustrophobia, momentarily suppressed by adrenaline, surged back with paralyzing force. He scrambled backward, testing the newly sealed passage, finding only tons of impenetrable earth. Then he heard a new, terrifying sound, a steady, dripping noise that rapidly accelerated into a frantic, powerful rush. The enemy had sealed the entrance and simultaneously diverted the high water table. Cold, muddy water began to pour down the ceiling seams, instantly pooling at his feet. This was not a quick drowning. This was psychological warfare designed to force him deeper into their prepared defenses. He aimed his light up. The seams were weeping torrents. The water level rose exponentially, ankle deep, then calf deep. He realized he had mere minutes before the chamber filled. The waiting game was over. It was a race against the earth itself. The cold water was a shocking contrast to the humid air, but the terror was purely psychological. He fought down the urge to panic, scanning the tight walls frantically for any sign of a bypass or ventilation shaft, knowing that every breath he took was stealing precious seconds from his oxygen supply. Driven by the rising, freezing water, Hogan located a minute fissure near the ceiling, a gap barely wide enough for a shoulder bag, much less a grown man. He stripped off his vest and helmet, pushing his gear ahead of him, wriggling into the muddy, clay-slicked passage. He moved like a snake, inches at a time, the rough earth tearing his skin, the water roaring inches below him in the chamber he had just vacated. Just as he cleared the tightest restriction and dropped into a drier, parallel tunnel, he found himself face-to-face with a young VC sapper. The enemy soldier, armed with an AK-47 but holding a flashlight and a sharpened entrenching tool, was just emerging from a side alcove, clearly tasked with monitoring this escape route. The proximity was instantaneous and brutal. No time for words, no distance for aiming. Combat erupted in a suffocating bubble of silence. Hogan suppressed .45 bucked once, the shot muffled by the tight space, hitting the sapper high in the chest. Simultaneously, the sapper swung the heavy shovel head, catching Hogan across the side of the head. Hogan stumbled, dropping his pistol, the world tilting violently. He drew his K-bar. The fight devolved into a primal, mud-slicked wrestling match in the dark, punctuated by grunts and the hideous, wet sound of flesh tearing. Hogan plunged the knife forward, finding the soft tissue of the sapper's neck. The body slumped silently, and Hogan collapsed next to it, the adrenaline burning out his fear, replaced by sheer exhaustion and the throbbing pain in his skull. The sudden violence of the combat was shocking, but the terror of the waiting water flooding the previous chamber had been far more consuming. Hogan leaned against the damp wall, spitting blood and mud, his breath ragged. He retrieved his .45 and secured the sapper's gear, including a map drawn crudely on oilskin. The close-quarters engagement had drained him, but the victory had pushed him further into the complex. He was deep, completely isolated, and operating on sheer instinct. The headwound made him dizzy, and the lack of proper ventilation was starting to thin the air. He began to hallucinate, seeing the movement of giant insects in the peripheral vision outside his lamp's cone. He forced himself to focus on the map. He saw intersecting lines, indicating a large, organized subterranean city. He also noticed a peculiar marking, a section labeled Chut Bay, flying rat trap. Pressing onward, he stumbled into a larger, unexpectedly dry chamber. It was a macabre storage area. Stacked against the far wall were rusted M16s, U.S. combat boots, and dog tags, trophies from battles fought years ago, confirming this complex was both an operational base and a tomb for past American soldiers. The discovery hardened his resolve. overriding the physical exhaustion and psychological strain. He wasn't just clearing tunnels now. He was entering hallowed, desecrated ground, and his mission morphed into one of grim, necessary vengeance. Following the cryptic map, Hogan eventually crawled into a cavern that smelled sharply of chemicals and metal shavings, the complex's nerve center. The room was roughly 15 feet across, high enough to stand in, and lit by a single, sputtering kerosene lamp. On a makeshift table were detailed schematics of Firebase Grizzly's fuel farm and access roads. Radios were tuned to VC frequencies, chattering softly. Most critically, stacked against the far wall were enough high-explosive charges, C4 and crude, locally sourced dynamite, to obliterate the entire airstrip. The mission objective had just multiplied in scope. He couldn't just escape, he had to neutralize this threat. The waiting was over. The time for decisive action was now. He began methodically setting his remaining timed fuses on the enemy explosives, careful to ensure a domino effect that would bring the entire cavern down. The minutes ticked by, each click of the timer a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. Just as he armed the last charge, a low, guttural cough broke the silence behind him. He spun, his .45 rising, but the figure wasn't rushing him. Standing silhouetted in the tunnel entrance was an older, lean VC officer, armed only with a machete, his face impassive and utterly cold. He was the tunnel warden, and he was patiently observing Hogan's predicament. The VC commander, who Hogan mentally labeled the warden, made no move to attack. He simply stood there, blocking the exit, his stillness radiating lethal confidence. This wasn't a desperate soldier. This was a seasoned sapper who understood the physics of the tunnels better than Hogan understood the laws of gravity. Hogan knew any missed shot or rapid movement would invite a suicidal counterattack in the confined space. The waiting returned, amplified by the immediate threat. Hogan held his position, the commander holding his. The warden slowly raised a hand, pointing a single, sharp finger not at Hogan, but toward the floor between them. Hogan cautiously followed the line of sight. Hidden beneath a thin layer of straw was the edge of a deep, square cut in the earth. A booby trap, a deep, camouflage pit lined with needle-sharp punji stakes, exactly matching the chut bay marking on the map. The warden wasn't rushing because he wanted Hogan to retreat blindly into the prepared kill zone. The tactical waiting game was excruciating. The warden knew Hogan was low on ammo and pressed for time due to the explosives. Hogan had to break the standoff without falling into the pit. He took a calculated risk, aiming not at the warden, but slightly high, firing one shot into the ceiling support beam next to the warden's head, hoping the noise and falling debris would force a temporary retreat or movement. The .45 shot reverberated violently, momentarily deafening Hogan. The warden, unperturbed by the near miss, vanished into the side tunnel almost instantly, not retreating, but calculating his next move. Hogan seized the brief window of opportunity. He activated the primary fuse on the explosives, a short, 5-minute timer, giving himself just enough time to find an alternate route out. The original tunnel was now impassable due to the warden, and the main entrance was collapsed and flooded. He scrambled toward the back of the command center, where the map showed a escape hatch leading to an auxiliary drainage system. He found a crude wooden door, jammed by humidity. He kicked it repeatedly, finally bursting through just as the first tremors of the explosives began to rock the cavern. He plunged into a claustrophobic crawl space, smelling strongly of sewage and mud, racing against the clock and the imminent collapse of the earth. He heard the distant, calculated sounds of the warden pursuing him, the faint scrape of the machete against the wall, gaining ground. Hogan pushed harder, the walls pressing in on him, the earth groaning. He used the only directional indicator he had, the distant, muffled sound of jets landing at Firebase Grizzly, vibrating faintly through the ground, guiding him toward the surface. The drainage tunnel pitched steeply upward, forcing Hogan to climb hand over hand through sludge and rock. The 5-minute timer was long dead, replaced by the terrifying, deafening rumble of the detonation behind him. The command center collapsed, sending a shockwave of compressed air and dust tearing through the narrow passage. Hogan felt the earth shift violently, a fracture running beneath him. He spotted a sliver of light, a break in the surface foliage just ahead. Using the last reserves of his strength, he clawed his way toward the opening, bursting through a thicket of razor grass and into the blinding midday sun. He lay there, gasping, tasting fresh air tainted only by the distant smoke rising from the now cratered location of the VC command center. He was coated head to toe in mud, blood, and the indelible stink of the deep earth. The silence of the jungle returned, vast and echoing, a stunning contrast to the crushing darkness he had just left. He triggered his emergency beacon, signaling his location to the nearby firebase. Looking back at the smoking hole, he knew the physical combat had been brief and brutal, but the true terror, the 15 minutes of pure suspense, the waiting, the crushing weight of the earth, and the agonizing lack of air, was the echo that would haunt him long after the mission was marked successful. He had survived the tunnels, but the tunnels had permanently rewritten the architecture of his fear.